Before we start this tutorial, I just want to say this is not a complete beginner's tutorial. You do need to have some basic knowledge of Blender, how to navigate in the viewport and how to switch between object mode and edit mode and pose mode and how to create basic shapes. Of course, you will need a skateboard model to be able to follow along with this tutorial. If you don't have one, I do have a time-lapse modeling video that show how I made this model. There is also a rigging time-lapse video if you don't have a lot of time to watch this tutorial. There are timestamps in the description so you can skip ahead to the part that you're interested in. And with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so to start it off, we need to make a new collection. So right click, new collection, Armature. Right click to change the color to green, and let's minimize the geometry folder, we don't need that. And let's select the board itself and the two edges of each side in the center. Shift S, cursor to selected. That way the pivot bone will be in the center of gravity of the board. Right, so again with the armature collection selected, Shift A, armature single bone, F2 to rename that, armature skateboard, tab G, Z, and drag it all the way down. Okay, and again F2 to rename that pivot center. Okay, and now we want to create the tilt bone that will actually control just the board itself. So it will do this rotation from side to side. And to do that, we want it to rotate from this point, or this point in the center. So what we will do is just select the face loop at the bottom of this metal plate. Come on. And Shift S, cursor to selected. Back to the armature. Shift A, G, Z, again drag it down, and we want the head of the bone to just be inside the pivot bone, and name that tilt. Now we also want to make the bones for the front wheels and the back wheels. So select either the left wheel or the right wheel, but don't put it in the middle. So let's Alt Shift left click to select the edge loop, cursor to selected. It needs to be in the center of the wheel. And now when we create another bone, G, Z, drag it down. We want the head to be below the board, and name that wheels front. We'll do the same thing for the back. Select the back wheel, select the edge loop, Shift S, cursor to selected, tab to go to edit mode, Shift D to duplicate the front wheels bone, and Shift S, selection to cursor. Rename that to wheels back. These are all the bones we need for the basic rig. And now we are going to parent everything. So select the wheels, the suspension, and the board. Select the armature, Control P with empty groups. And now we are going to each part and delete the vertex group that we don't need. For this one, we just want the tilt bone, tab to go to edit mode, A to select everything, and assign. We'll do the same process for the other parts. For the back wheels, obviously we only need the back wheels vertex group, A to select everything and assign. Front wheels, just need the front vertex group, A to select everything, assign. The suspension I'm going to parent for the pivot center for now, but we'll delete it later on. Okay, so delete all the other vertex group, A, assign, same thing for the back. Assign. And now we need to parent the bones. So in edit mode, select the wheel bones and the tilt bone and parent them all to the pivot center. Keep offset. Control tab to go to pose mode. And let's see that it's all working. And tilt bone, the wheel bone, make sure they are working properly. And this is our basic rig. To make the rig a little bit more complex, we want to add a few more bones to it. So the first thing we want to do is to take the suspension geometry and clear the parent and delete the vertex group as well. And to make the suspension bones, we want it to be in the lower part of the suspension, or the lower part of the shock absorber. So the easiest way to do that would be in side view. In X-ray mode, just select the vertices on either side. Shift S, cursor to selected. Select the armature and create a new bone. Drag the head all the way down. And rename that suspension font. And then we can just duplicate and move it to the back. Again, go to side view, in X-ray mode, select the two vertices on either side, cursor to selected, and just duplicate the suspension bone, Shift S, selection to cursor, and rename that to suspension back. Okay, now we need two more bones, one for the pivot back and one pivot front. And this is why we made the wheel bone on the side and not in the middle. So select the wheels, Shift S, cursor to selected, select the armature, Shift A, create a new bone. Again, drag it all the way down and name that pivot back. We'll do the same thing in the front, select the front wheels, cursor to selected, Shift D to duplicate the pivot bone, Shift S, selection to cursor, F2, rename that pivot front. We need one more bone, Shift S, cursor to world origin, Shift A, G, Z, drag it all the way down below the tilt bone. And this one will be the root bone. It will control the entire rig. And now we need to do some reparenting. So let's parent the front wheel to the front suspension. Keep offset. The back wheel to the back suspension. Keep offset. And of course the suspension and the tilt to be parented to the center pivot. Now the center pivot will be parented in a constraint to the front and the back pivot. But for now we'll just select those pivots and parent them to the root bone. And let's just check that everything is working fine. Control tab, go to pose mode. The wheel is okay. The suspension is not okay because we need to parent the actual suspension geometry as well. So select the suspension geometry, select the rig and parent with empty groups. Once again, we'll start with the front suspension. We only want the suspension front bone, so we can delete everything else. And tab to go to edit mode, A to select everything, assign, exactly the same thing in the back. This time we want the back suspension bone. Shift A, tab to go to edit mode, A, select everything and assign. And now if we go control tab, you can see that the suspension is working properly in the back as well. And if we drag the center bone, the root bone, it only controls the two pivots for now, but the center bone control pretty much the entire rig, and we'll fix that in a moment. But this is all the bones that we need for this rig. In order to use the pivot points properly, we need to create a pivot switcher, and we are going to do that by using constraint and custom properties. So first let's create our custom property. Let's go to the object properties. At the bottom we have custom properties, add, and right now we can switch between 0 and 1 gradually with the decimal point, so we can have values in between. What we want to have is either 0 or 1 on and off switch. So let's edit that. Name that pivot switch, and the property value, instead of 1.0, we need to change it to 1. And let's put the default on 0 and press OK. And now it's just 0 or 1. And the idea is that 0 will be the back pivot, will control the rig, and 1, the front pivot, will control the rig. Let's turn it to 1 and right click on that, copy data path. We are going to need that. So we are going to use now the center pivot and go to the constraint properties, add constraint, child off. this is basically a parent constraint. So the target would be the armature, and the bone would be the pivot back. And let's name that child of back, just so we don't get confused later on. And now if we test, we can see that the back pivot is controlling the rig. We want to put a driver on the influence bar. So if it's 0, if the custom property is on 0, the influence is 1. And if the custom property is on 1, the influence on 0. For the front pivot, it will be the other way around. So right click on the influence and add driver, show in driver editor, scale it up. First, let's change the expression, just var, and we want to use single property. The property will be the skateboard, and the path will be the data path that we copied for the pivot switch. One more thing we want to do is we want to go to the F curve, and we want to reverse the curve that we have. So let's start with the top point. The right point will change the value from 1 to 0, and the other point from 0 to 1. Okay, let's close that and see that it's actually working. We can see that the influence is on 1. And again, if we test the pivot bone, we can see that it's working fine. Let's go to the custom property and change it to 1. And now it has no influence. Right, so back to the center pivot, we will do the same for the front. Once again, add a child of constraint. Target is the armature, the bone is the pivot front. Right now they are both on 1, which is not something we want. So let's just copy the driver from child of back to child of front. Paste driver and name that to front. Now we go into edit the driver. Show in driver editor. Hide the front one, and again in the F curve we want to reverse the direction, so 1 should be 0 and 0 should be 1. Close that. Now we can see that the influence is different. Let's test it out. Back pivot has the control, front pivot has no control. And if we change the pivot switch to 1, the front pivot has the control and the back pivot has no control. Now, to animate the wheels, we can just take the bones and manually rotate them. But it will be better to just create an automatic system so that when we play the animation, they will rotate without using any keyframes. To do that, we need to add another custom property. And this one will be speed wheels font. This one you can do with or without the decimal point. And I will put the max to 10 in this case, just to have more control. And right click, copy data path. And let's change the rotation mode. So let's change it from quaternion to XYZ Euler. And we want to rotate on the x-axis. So right click, add driver, show in driver editor, and press on the period key to zoom in. Expression change to var, and again we want single property. Property is the armature, and paste the data path. Now we want to select this top point. In the F curve, we want to change the value to 180. Let's close that for now. And we can see that it made a difference. If we drag it from 1 to 0, we can see the custom property is now controlling our wheel. But when we play the animation, nothing is happening. So let's go back to frame 1 and right click on that and copy the data path from this frame. Go back to edit driver and show in driver editor. And in the drivers tab, we want to add input variable. This one we can call it time. And instead of prop, we want to click on the drop down and select scene and select the scene that we have. Data path, we paste our frame, and now we want to multiply them, so var multiply time, close that. Now if we play the animation, nothing is happening because it's on 0, but if we drag it, it starts spinning, and if we drag it some more, it's spinning faster, and it can go all the way up to 10. So let's drag it down back to 0, and we'll do one for the back wheels. So add speed wheels back, again default to 0 and max to 10. Copy the driver from the front bone to the backbone. Again, change the rotation to XYZ Euler. On the x-axis, paste driver. Now edit the driver, because instead of wheels front, we want to change it to wheels back. And now we have separate controls for the back wheels and the front wheels. At this point, the rig is basically done, and it's time to do the first cleanup phase. So let's start with the wheels, the back wheels. We can just lock the location, scale, and rotation. We only want the X rotation. which is controlled by the custom properties. We'll do the same for the wheels in the front. Just lock everything that we don't need so we don't use it by mistake. The root bone is going to need everything. The tilt bone only going to use the Z rotation. It's the local Z. The bones work in the local axis, so it's going to be the Z axis for the rotation rather than the Y axis. So we are going to lock the location and the scale, but not the rotation. For the rotation, we are going to use a constraint, a limit rotation constraint. Limit X, Y, and Z, affect the transform and change it to local space. Now, the value will be different for different skateboards, depend on the dimensions that you have. For mine, I find it best on 12.5. So that way, when I look at it in front view, it's getting close to the wheel without actually touching it. And because we limited the X and Y rotation in the constraint, we don't need to lock them in the transform tab. We'll do the same thing for the suspension. We'll do Z, X, Y because Z is the axis that we are going to rotate. Now you can just lock that completely. I am going to give it a little bit of rotation. In this case, I'm going to put it into -3 and +3. So it has very little animation, but still some, just in case that it's needed. And we'll do the same for the back suspension. Z, X, Y, lock the location, lock the scale, add constraint, limit rotation, limit X, Y, Z, affect transform, local space, -3 and +3. Okay, now the center pivot, I'm going to leave it on quaternion for now because that really depends on the animation. So I'm just going to lock the scale for the pivot because we do need to move and rotate it. Also for the back pivot and the front pivot. Now let's make sure that all the bones are working fine. Let's do the root bone. It's dragging everything. And the pivot switch is on 1, so the front bone is controlling the rig. If we change it back to 0, the backbone is controlling the rig. The tilt is working fine. The wheels are working. Well, we can't rotate them manually. We have to use the wheel speed for that. And this is the first cleanup done. Before we do the second cleanup phase, we want to create some custom shapes so it will be easier to control the rig and that it will look nicer. In order to do that, we are going to use an add-on called Orient Bone Shapes by Scaredyfish. You can get it for free on GitHub. A link to that is in the description. You don't have to use it. I just find it make things easier. Okay, so now that you install the add-on, we want to create, let's go back to object mode and create a new collection. This will be the custom shapes, and I put it in brown, and let's create a new circle and go to top view, scale it down, and then scale it on the x-axis. And name that CS root. This is the custom shape for the root bone. So with the add-on enabled, so we click on the custom shape, shift click the armature, control tab to go to pose mode, select the bone that we want, in this case the root bone, right click, set and align bone shape. Okay, and now we can just hide this custom shape and move on to the next one, which is the bone tilt. In edit mode, select the tail. Sorry. Select the tail. Shift S, cursor to selected. Shift A, circle. Size radius to 4. And change it to 16. Rotation 90 on the x-axis, and in front view you're going to just drag it down, and in edit mode we are going to select the top half and delete that. A to select everything, E to extrude, then right click, S to scale, G, Z, and delete half of it. Then press A, delete only faces. Then delete the edges in between. Select the top edge and extrude that up. Select the edges on either side, extrude, and right click SX to drag it out. Select the vertices at the top, merge at center. Delete the faces, only faces, and then the inside edges. Mirror that and apply the mirror. This one will be CS tilt. And just like we did with the root bone, select the custom shape, shift select the armature, control tab to go to pose mode, choose the bone that we need, in this case the tilt bone, right click, set and align bone shape. Okay, control tab to go back to object mode, and then shift D to duplicate this tilt and hide the original. Now we can do the suspension shape. So click on the tail, Shift S, cursor to selected, select the custom shape, Shift S, selection to cursor, and let's scale it down. Name that CS suspension. It will be for both the front, the back, and the front. And Shift select, Control Tab, select the bone that we want. Set and align bone shape. Control Tab to go to object mode. Go to edit mode. In the armature, select the tail on the front suspension. Shift S, cursor to selected. Select our custom shape. Shift S, selection to cursor. And exactly the same thing. Select the bone that we want. Set and align bone shape. And now we can hide this. Now for the center pivot, I'm going to click on the head, Shift S, cursor to selected. Shift A, UV sphere. Change it to 4 or 2. And let's change the segments and radius to segments and rings to 8. And delete only faces. Shift select the armature, select the center pivot, set and align bone shape. Name that CS pivot center. Hide it. Now we're going to select the head of the pivot back. Cursor to selected. Shift A, circle, and in edit mode, going to select everything. Shift D, R, X 90. Shift D, R, Z 90. Let's select everything and scale it down a little bit. Shift select the armature. Select the pivot back bone. Right click, set and align bone shape. And do the same for the front. Cursor to selected. Select the circle that we made. Name that CS pivot. And Shift S, selection to cursor. Didn't work out very well, so Shift S, cursor to selected to the center of the object. And origin to 3D cursor. And now we can go back to the head of the pivot. Shift S, selection to cursor. And then set and align bone shape. Hide this, and this is how we make the custom shapes for this model. We don't have any custom shapes for the wheel bones, and that brings us to the second and final cleanup. So we are not going to be able to use the wheel bones in the viewport. We had the driver, we made the custom properties for that. So to clean it up, we can just select the two wheel bones, press M, and then move it to another layer. the second thing we can do to that is give that the custom shapes color, and we do that in the object data properties under bone groups. Can select the root bone, click on the plus sign, assign that to the bone, and let's make this one blue. I like to name the groups based on the color. I will just call that one blue, and then I will change that to custom color set, and I will change that one to something more blue, and I will give them all the same color, and then this one will be slightly different, so that way I know which one is selected and which one isn't. Now I will make a second group for the rotation bones. So click on the plus sign, assign, and this one will be yellow. So rename that. Custom color set, and let's make them all the same color, and this one will be slightly orange. That way, again, easier to see which one I'm selecting. One more group for the pivot bones. Click on the plus sign, this one will be red, and red one assign, custom color set. With the color picker, make sure that they are all the same color, and then this one slightly different. And this is our color coded rig. Now we still have two pivot bones, and it can be a little bit confusing to figure out which one is the active pivot. So we are going to make a driver to influence their visibility. So in the pivot center bone, we have the two child of constraint, and we are going to use them. So we are going to copy the driver from the child of front, copy driver, then go to the back pivot, and under bone properties viewport display, we have the hide function. So we are going to right click on that and paste driver. Nothing happened just yet. Oh, it did, but we can't see it for now. We'll see it in a moment. Go back to the pivot center, copy the child of back, copy driver, go to the front pivot, and again, under bone properties, viewport display, hide, right click, paste driver, and it disappeared. If we go back to the pivot switch and change it from 0 to 1, the back disappeared and the front one appeared, and now it's in control. So whichever one is visible is controlling the rig. This is basically all the cleanup for the rig itself, and now we'll do some cleanup for the scene. So let's minimize the custom shapes folder, and let's go to the selectable option. We want to disable the selection on the geometry, and we want to just completely disable the custom shapes. We are not going to need it anymore. It's just here for backup. And then remove the selectable option. That way we can't get to the geometry by mistake. We also want to go to Shift S and cursor to world origin to put it in the right place. Reset the timeline, and that is our rig complete.